Hello, everyone. Thank you again for a wonderful week of very interesting, exciting, and reflective responses to the Kaplan and Kubota article. They're very interesting pieces, and I can see that the discussion that emerged over the course of the week is very reflective of what the debate in contrastic rhetoric has been over the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years, especially since the critical movement in second language education, notably done by Ryoko Kubota, Bonnie Norton, Shresh Kanagaraja, and Alistair Pennycook, for example, many of whom were actually OISE graduates in the early 90s. So what I'd like to do, I know Mary is doing the summarizing for this week, so I wanted to kind of chime in and give a little bit of my own input. And I'm still trying to figure out how to respond and when to respond, because there are so many times in the middle of the week I want to jump in, but I don't want to interrupt the flow of conversation and intervene in conversations and uh, distract people from other thoughts. So I'm still trying to figure out the happy medium. So what I'd like to do is draw on a few things that came up and kind of give you my feelings about them. I really liked, in particular, how everybody, can see the plus and minuses of contrastive rhetoric, or what is now called intercultural rhetoric. Kaplan certainly essentializes these thought patterns, as he calls them, and keep in mind that when he wrote this and came up with this, Chomskyism was at its height, and it's not studied so much now in second language acquisition theory. When I was doing my master's, I don't know, 15 years ago, it was. But there's certainly been a paradigm shift since then. And Chomsky's sort of innate notion of grammar and innate things in general largely guided most things in linguistics and in writing theory. So Kaplan was drawing on that framework largely to kind of explain what he thought was happening. He did, as many of you noted, assume that many students have full competency in writing in their first language, and we know that's not true. Many of you talked about many of your students who, are having difficulty writing their second language, and when you talk to them, their competency in their first is minimal. And I know in my own experience, I've worked with many students whose language backgrounds, academic language backgrounds, they did little or no writing whatsoever. In fact, knowledge was measured by oral exams. I've had many students over the last 20 years from the former Soviet Union, and in those cultural contexts, so it was explained to me by my students that writing was not foregrounded in any of the assignments. Largely it was oral exams where you'd sit in front of a panel of examiners. So knowledge display was verbal rather than written. So coming to a North American context, there was a new way in which to, how do you, thinking about, researching and representing knowledge in a particular way for a particular audience. On the other hand, many of you talked about patterns that you still may notice in student writing that seems to be particular or unique to a particular group. And I can certainly say in my own experience, I've wondered those same questions myself. I think, well, I see certain grammatical problems or ways of organizing text that seem unique to a particular group. And I think it's largely this tension between these two that's kept contrastive rhetoric around for so long, because compositionists and second language scholars are certainly interested in this and trying to figure out exactly what's happening and what are the factors involved. And I forget, someone was posting about critical contrastive rhetoric, which actually I pull off my shelf and it looks like this. If you haven't read it, it's by Kubota and Lerner. And they're trying to, again, push using a critical framework to look beyond this traditional structuralist view of writing. Everybody writes in a particular way because it's their culture, it's innate, and kind of problematizing some of those ideas to get a sense, as many of you actually said, contrastive rhetorics, that there's a plurality here, and there are many factors involved in rhetoric. Degree of education, how the curriculum itself represents knowledge or talks about writing, resources that students have in their first languages versus their second languages. So the topic itself is very complex, and not to, as they always remind us, not to look at, for example, English as this particular gold standard of the way in which to write and the way in which to represent knowledge, which often happens in language classrooms. So the issue around power certainly is important to consider when looking at contrastive rhetoric. There is a new term for it that I mentioned last week, and this is Ulla Connor's new book called Intercultural Rhetoric in the Writing Classroom. So Ulla Connor and Ryoko Kubota quotes her quite frequently and sort of contesting her, or responding to her, I should say. And in Intercultural Rhetoric, Ulla Connor tries to draw on different theoretical frameworks to position her revised way of seeing rhetoric, if you will. So she pulls on multiliteracies theory, which allows a greater degree of flexibility in looking at rhetorical patterns and the different types of literacy practices students bring to the writing classroom. And so she goes into great detail, drawing on people like James G. and his work, for example. One example I'll pull out of there that I thought was very interesting that stopped me and got me thinking about it was translation studies, which is something that isn't often talked about in second language writing theory at all. And she talks about how people who are studying translation really need to draw on something that's called comparative rhetoric. In comparative rhetoric, and if you're interested in that, there's a scholar named Yu, who in 2008 wrote an article that's included in an edited volume also by Ulla Connor that looks at writing that's particular ways in which knowledge is represented or rhetorical forms that are unique perhaps to a particular culture. So for example, if you're writing from English into German, or translating rather from English into German, you can do sort of a straight translation, all right, just putting the words and ideas down. Or the aspect where you step back and think, okay, my audience is going to be a German audience. What do I need to know about how German is written, how the rhetorical structure may differ from English in terms of sentence length? How can I revise my English paragraphs to fit into a particular paragraph development that a German reader would respond to, so the integrity of the text is maintained. So comparative rhetoric looks a lot at that, and so she draws on that as well to kind of explain that intercultural rhetoric certainly has a place in second language learning theory, and we can certainly draw on what Ryoko Kubota and Al Lerner say, that there's certainly a critical aspect to it too, but she definitely finds it to be very important and doesn't want to let it go. And she shouldn't, because it's quite interesting, I think. And by your conversations, you seem to have enjoyed it very much as well.